Thank you to the FSM Alliance for having us this morning, and to all of you for joining us. Hopefully we're going to have something of a dialogue. I am Robin Tompkins, as Jan mentioned, from JG Africa, working as the Senior Water Advisor to the USAID Resilient Waters Program, under which this activity is taking place. It's under a grant to JG Africa from Resilient Waters. And I am a WASH specialist and new student of fecal sludge management, especially in the context of transboundary basin management and water security. So I am, since Suvi is going to be starting the presentation, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Subrita to introduce herself and get us going. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jan, and thanks, Robin, for the introductions. I see a lot of familiar names coming online, so a few people know who I am, but for those who don't, my name is Subrita Ramphal. I am an associate at JG Africa, and for the last 4.5 years, I've been working on a USAID Resilient Waters program together with Robin. I'm the WASH specialist on the program, and we've been coordinating water supply, sanitation, hygiene activities across different countries in Southern Africa. My background is also water, and very recently through this program, rural sanitation. And today we're just going to take you through some of the, next slide, please, Jan. Today, we're going to take you through some of the linkages and lessons that have emerged through a project that JG Africa received as a grant through the USAID Resilient Waters Program, and just sharing some of the lessons learned and the linkages that we've been able to observe from implementing city-level sanitation through to a national strategy development, and then also the linkages from city-level sanitation through to transboundary basin management. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start first with a bit of a background on the USAID Resilient Waters Program. Robin, please, will you mute your mic?
Oh, sorry.
No problem, thank you. So the picture you have in front of you is Southern Africa. What you can see is the outline of both the Okavango River Basin and the Limpopo River Basins. And this basically indicates the footprint of the USAID Resilient Waters Program. So we started, so the USAID Resilient Waters Program started in 2018. It's been running now for 4.5 years. We're expecting to conclude in next year. Effectively, we have been operating in 7 African countries. We've got 4 core components, which I will share with you in the next slide. And we were a $32.5 million project. Now, our main aim in this project was to identify interventions and institutions that we could strengthen resilience, promote water security in both communities and ecosystems, with the overall aim of improving transboundary management of resources, and as well as increasing access to safe drinking water and sanitation services. Next slide, please, Jan. The 4 core areas that we needed to deliver our program objectives are cut across a number of sectors. So the first area that we focused on was looking specifically at transboundary institutions and identifying and designing of transboundary resources in the 2 river basins. Secondly, one of the core objectives and one of the interventions which we will be presenting here today was designing interventions around increasing access to safe and sustainable drinking water and sanitation services. Thirdly, we looked at, if I can just skip to the 4th point, we were also looking at designing around conserving biodiversity and ecosystem services. And then looking at those 3 objectives, how we also had to look at designing interventions that will essentially improve livelihoods within the communities that we've been working with throughout the project. Below, you can see that the implementing partners, the key implementing partner is Chemonics International, and they are supported by 4 other organizations, JG Africa, of which Robin and I are working through, Genesis Analytics, the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, and Peace Parks Foundation. Next slide, please. So the context within which this particular project that we are going to share today on is focusing more on the Limpopo River Basin. Now, Resilient Waters, we work at multiple levels to build more resilient and water-secure Southern African communities and ecosystems. At a transboundary level, we're working with transboundary commissions, such as the Limpopo Watercourse Commission, the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. These are denoted in yellow blocks on the map, and also the newly established Busi Pungwe Save Watercourse Commission. And the objective here is to strengthen these institutions to better deliver on their mandate, which is cross-country coordination of water resources for sustainability. At a regional level, we are also working with biosphere reserves, such as the Waterberg Biosphere Reserve, the Groot Marico Biosphere Reserve, and the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Reserve. And in some of these biosphere reserves, we're working to expand the biosphere's footprint, increase investment and attention towards preserving these natural springs and water towers, and then lastly, to promote livelihoods development through natural resource beneficiation. At a national level, as a program, we're working with national departments of water and sanitation to improve management of on-site sanitation in Botswana, South Africa, and Mozambique, which is what we've identified through this program, an area not given sufficient attention in national sanitation planning. And then lastly, at a local level, Resilient Waters is working with local municipalities in South Africa and Mozambique to integrate inclusive sanitation and climate resilience into urban planning. Next slide, please. So what you're looking at in this slide is a heat map of human influence on terrestrial ecosystems. The red spots highlight high levels of human influence on such terrestrial ecosystems. And what we can see in this map is that they converge around towns or urban areas within the Limpopo River Basin. Therefore, one can look at changes in urban areas as flags for potential change to come in biodiversity within a basin. And ultimately, these changes in the urban areas and thus biodiversity areas will impact the resilience of the basin and its capacity to deliver clean water to urban areas. Consistent and increasing poor sanitation upstream is a potential driver of poor water quality downstream, which could lead to comprising the resilience of the basin. Therefore, from our point of view within the project, these red areas in the basin are good starting points to understand where to prioritize interventions that could lead to overall basin resilience. And sanitation can be that starting point. Although we know that the links are quite tenuous in terms of actions on the ground, it's increasingly coming into focus. And one example we can give is the Nature Conservancy's Urban Water Blueprint, where it highlights the potential for improved sustainability in water services for urban areas downstream, and where upper catchment management and green infrastructure solutions are deployed. So in essence, Resilient Waters has a biodiversity conversation component, and resilience is closely linked to climate change. But the question is, what about WASH, which is a national level concern? Next slide, please. From our perspective, sanitation naturally links with groundwater and surface water, among other areas. Transboundary is concerned with resource protection, resource management, and finding the balance with the increasing demands and stresses on the resource, both upstream and downstream. And such demands are and we all know this, high rates of development, growth, increase in urban population, climate change impacts and stresses, which all put additional pressure on existing water and sanitation systems, both in rural and urban areas. Therefore, from our perspective, addressing localized solutions such as poor sanitation in urban systems collectively in a basin should contribute to overall resource protection and better management. And this brings me to the next slide, please, which is the next concept of water security. The conceptual framework for water security shows that thinking about water in terms of a water use cycle supports sustainable WASH services delivery, which in turn reduces the risk to freshwater ecosystems, which from our perspective then would improve sustainability in WASH services delivery and the race to the top, which is all centered around the circular economy thinking. Integrated thinking is critical to water security, but how do we do that in practice? From Resilient Water's point of view, and with its WASH component within a transboundary program approach, it allowed for these conditions to be created for us to make an attempt. And so we have to ask ourselves is, what is this activity all about? Next slide, please. And this leads us to this particular activity that JJ Africa was implementing on behalf of the USAID Resilient Waters program. We received a grant from the program, and we were implementing a project over 2 phases. The first is a pilot project in Polokwane that piloted 4 fecal sludge management planning tools. And these tools were the city service delivery assessment, the fecal flow waste diagram, also known as the SFD, a reuse options analysis, and a sanitation safety plan. In addition, an urban resilience toolkit was developed to make linkages between sanitation and resilience in the context of basin management. Furthermore, what we had done in the second part to our grant was we took the findings from the pilot project in Polokwane, and we used that as inputs into the development of a national fecal sludge management strategy for South Africa, which was the first for the country. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is where I'm going to ask Robin to step in, because this is the point where we're going to share some of our lessons learned and our linkages both from city level to national, and then from city level to transboundary context. Thanks.
Okay, so if we can just go back, thank you. In these, there's some exceedingly busy slides coming up, and I'm going to show you how the project was set up to attempt to make those linkages that Suvi's been discussing between biodiversity, basin management, sanitation, etc. So as mentioned, there's 2 phases of activities, and these activities were identified based on the needs of stakeholders. And against those activities, we established a number of project management mechanisms to be able to implement those activities in the 2 phases and also maintain stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. So this horrendogram, the colors show the different phases of the project, the red being the current phase. This is the phase we're in at the moment. The green is all about the development phase. And as I mentioned, we very much targeted these activities into stakeholder needs, which were identified through a gap analysis of the GLASS report, which was our approach in Resilient Waters in all the countries, because the reason for that is because GLASS is a stakeholder mechanism. It's the stakeholders in the country, the national stakeholders compile the survey, and therefore our assumption was that a gap analysis of that survey would highlight key stakeholder needs, and we wouldn't need to spend 4 years getting buy-in. Based on that, FSM was on-site sanitation was identified as a priority in South Africa. And so we gathered the Resilient Waters footprint is in the Limpopo Basin. That big red area on the map Suvi showed you earlier is Polokwane. So we gathered municipalities in the Limpopo Basin and the Department of Water and Sanitation regional and national level. And we had a workshop to identify what we should do about FSM being a priority. And that led to the establishment of these two phases. Resilient Waters being a transboundary basin program, it was important to have that linkage to the transboundary level. We have sanitation activities in other countries of the basin as well, particularly Shai, which is downstream of Polokwane, and we're also working with sanitation and sanitation overall, not necessarily fecal sludge management in Botswana. So the urgent need at national level was for a strategy for fecal sludge management. So that became phase 2. But it didn't make sense with FSM being a relatively new concept to do a strategy in the midst of nothing. And so we looked at doing a case study in Polokwane to look at what would be realistic to implement with regard to FSM in the next 10 years. And that was by piloting those 4 fecal sludge management tools and then making those linkages to the basin level and to the broader resilience level by using sanitation as a platform for looking at how it can support broader urban resilience. So we're starting to move into the lessons phase now. We have a second draft of the strategy ready to go for consultation. Well, DWS has a second draft of the strategy, and we are looking at using these lessons as a basis for work that we are going to do in Shai. Next slide, please. So this crazy slide is all about the mechanisms that we established to implement these various phases. And I think the starting point in both cases was a collaboration agreement. The collaboration agreements exist now between Resilient Waters and the Department of Water and Sanitation, and also between Resilient Waters and the Polokwane local municipality. So the scope of those agreements essentially what they set out what Resilient Waters is going to do and what the municipality is going to do in the context of the case study, and also what Resilient Waters is going to do and what DWS is going to do in the context of phase 2. So we have a number of mechanisms on the ground that we've been implementing through the last year or so. That is a national project steering committee meeting. We have bilateral meetings, which are generally chaired by Department of Water and Sanitation, and in some cases held outside of Resilient Waters by DWS. It's wonderful support and buy-in, it's beyond buy-in from them. We've had stakeholder consultation workshops for the strategy. We've had a first round of those, about to go into a second. We have project management meetings. Now, our project management team sits across the 2 phases. So we've got DWS representation, and there the representation is both regional and national from Department of Water and Sanitation, and also from the Sanitation Division and the International Waters Division. Also, Polokwane local municipality is on our project management team, and of course, Resilient Waters. In the municipality, we've held a number of technical workshops in the various work streams of the project. You'll see the horrendogram of that shortly. And we've done presentations on other platforms in the municipality, for example, the Environmental Management Forum, Disaster Management Forum, etc. We've done stakeholder outreach, and here have been greatly supported by both the Polokwane local municipality team and DWS Regional. And DWS Regional has also, and PLM have also helped with various bilaterals with stakeholders, and we have a provincial PSC. So a profusion of mechanisms. We will continue with somewhat less of them as we go into the final phases of this project, but we will maintain the PSC and particularly the project management team meetings, which sits across both phases. So we've had a number of champions. As I mentioned, DWS, we've Mpela Raptsoa from the municipality has been with us all along. Unfortunately, we lost one of our team members to COVID. Which was a blow for all of us. DWS Regional Ronald Matakani and National Iris Mate and Lusanda Basi make up basically the core of the project management team that and really these the folk that we work with at local and national government level have been real champions of on-site sanitation and fecal sludge management, and are really key to the implementation of this project. Next slide, please. But for all that good stuff that happened through our mechanisms, and hindsight is 2020, we have recognized that there are some missing bits or missing mechanisms. Our project management team did not include an urban resilience specialist. Our urban resilience team actually are based in India. We've the communication around the urban resilience component, I don't think has been as significant as the sanitation work streams of this project. We've also I think missed out potentially on some specific targeting of basin organizations on the project steering committee. And we also, I don't think we've managed to establish, or at least managed to establish sufficiently, a sanitation platform with river basin organizations. We aren't at the point yet where I think we're taking the evidence through to the RBO platform. Also, we haven't done much exploration of how integrated sanitation might be in basin monitoring systems. Our team at Polokwane municipality was the sanitation team. Our work, while the International Waters Department of the division of the Department of Water and Sanitation has been involved, our key engagements and the project management team, the core team, is with the sanitation division. So there are some issues around there which I think we could have used in our mechanisms to strengthen the urban resilience and the basin linkages, but we've done. Those mechanisms have taken us very far in implementing the sanitation components of the project. Somehow I managed to mute myself. I'd like to hand over to Suvi to explain what phase one of the project actually looked like on the ground. Thanks. I'll mute myself now, Suvi.
Thanks, Robs. Jan, if I could please ask you to skip to, you can also skip to the next slide. So this is just to give you an idea of what phase one, the pilot project, looked like in Polokwane. We did mention before at the beginning, we had to pull together a number of planning tools to build the evidence through the rollout of these tools that later was then used, the findings were used to guide some aspects of the development of the strategy. But you can see that there were a number of components. I'm not necessarily going to read all of them. Next slide, please. And what I would just like to highlight is you saw that there were a number, it's about 4 or 5 or 6 tools that we had to bring together. And some of the lessons that we can share about the rollout of these tools was that there was a lot of, it was a demanding process, both on the municipality's time as well as the expert team's time. And what we observed was there was quite a bit of expert team. And when I say expert team, I mean from the USAID Resilient Waters Program, from JG Africa. There's a lot of consultant time that went into working with the municipality in working through the various aspects of the tools, and also equally demanding of the Polokwane municipality's time in engaging with the consultant team in identifying and finding the information, verifying the information, discussing the data that was integrated into these tools. And what we've observed is that the time and the money that was spent on these processes is something that's not necessarily accessible to most municipalities in South Africa without external funding. What we've also observed through this pilot project is that inclusive sanitation as a concept is not necessarily well understood by municipal officials as and when we were engaging them through online engagements, in-person meetings and in-person workshops. And especially in the context of which there are traditional approaches and promoted approaches in South Africa, such as flush toilets and sewer sanitation. From our perspective, the combination of the tools that we showed in the previous slide was quite expensive to implement. We found that the buy-in from the municipal manager was critical in ensuring participation from municipal officials from various departments. And it was so crucial in the rollout of these tools that at some point, us as the project team also recognized towards the end of 2021, we could see a bit of the commitment waning as we all experienced fatigue with online meetings and online engagements. But one of the positives we can share is that, and it's a mechanism that Robin mentioned earlier on, we started off with a formal collaboration agreement. And this really assisted us in generating that initial commitment and momentum from the municipality. And it also allowed us to constantly always refer back to the agreement when we reached some difficult times throughout the project. We do recognize, again, and I say this, the burden of time that it put on the municipal officials. What some of the thoughts that we've had through this process is that we need to consider what is possible in implementing these tools in South African municipalities without external funding. Do we focus on low-cost technologies, low-cost solutions? Do we look at a less intimidating range of new technologies? And what is almost not immediately available and what is immediately available to municipalities? Next slide, please. Another observation that we've had through this project, right at the beginning, is around stakeholders and the myriad of stakeholders that's required to build a picture around inclusive sanitation for municipalities. We realized very early on that there were stakeholders from a range of institutions that were required. And in addition to that, each institution required a different level of messaging. And what was difficult for us was to try and keep track of the different messages, and it was hard to continuously keep institutions updated with the objectives of this particular project. What we also realized is because there were multiple stakeholders and different messaging, it was also quite expensive, time consuming, both for ourselves as the expert team, but also for the municipalities. One of the outcomes is that we need to think around what are new ways of communicating when it comes to thinking around inclusive sanitation and applying these multiple tools. One of the biggest challenges we experienced, and Robin mentioned this, is the concept of urban resilience and how that integrates into inclusive sanitation planning. When we started with the urban resilience tool, there were a whole new bunch of stakeholders that we needed to consult that were equally important as the stakeholders that were required for the sanitation planning. And we experienced such difficulty in generating the commitment from this whole new set of stakeholders under the Urban Resilience Toolkit. We had many attempts to coordinate online sessions, in-person workshops, and with attendance that we would have liked to have been much higher than expected. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, is there a better way? At what point do we start integrating urban resilience with inclusive sanitation as part of this planning program? And how do we continue thinking around building general capacity for FSM that integrates these types of terminologies? Next slide, please. And then lastly, we look at some of the external factors that were just out of our control. We all know the impacts of the restrictions and the lockdowns with COVID. This pushed out some of our timeframes. All of our work had to be done online through online workshops. And it was quite difficult to have meaningful discussions around very sensitive data, especially when it comes to sanitation with the municipality. But I have to say that the commitment that we had from the municipality and the Department of Water and Sanitation when we did have those discussions was extremely valuable in moving the process forward. What also challenged us was not having access to any of the standards when it came to FSM and FSM technologies and what was available both locally and outside of the country. And then just in general, the economic downturn of not only within the country, but outside of the country, and the impact that it had on the individuals that were part of that process. All of that factored into some of the challenges that were out of our control through this project. Next slide, please. We do want to share some of the positives, though, and we have been sharing it throughout this process. We, as an outcome of the pilot project, we do have a set of reports for the municipality, and it's a series of reports, one that represents the findings of the fecal flow diagram and the city service delivery assessment, one that presents the findings of the sanitation safety plan, which encompasses the risks to health and humans. And taking all of that information together, we've also put together a report for the municipality that looks at very specific technology and reuse options that are specific for Polokwane municipality based on the findings from the fecal flow diagram, the city service delivery, as well as the sanitation safety planning. And what we were able to do is consolidate that report and share it as a package with the municipality. In addition to that, and we've been saying it throughout this presentation, we've made great linkages with the National Fecal Sludge Management Strategy. Robin is going to share more about that in the later slides. We've had great communication and support from both the Department of Water and Sanitation and the Polokwane municipality. And what we've realized as well is that there is a strong capacity in municipalities for FSM. It's just how do we think about transforming that capacity to address some of the nuances and the new concepts introduced around fecal sludge management. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Robin, who's going to just chat about some of the linkages that we've made to the National Fecal Sludge Management Strategy. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. And Jan, I think we are speaking longer than we expected, so please move on. Thank you. Okay, so phase 2 of the project was to develop a national fecal sludge management strategy, and we had an amazing professional team to help us do that. And as we've already mentioned, incredible collaboration with the Department of Water and Sanitation. So the strategy is a 10-year strategy. that's the conceptual framework, which is in the public domain. So I'm not going to go into the details of it. But next slide, please. The key issue about the strategy is that it needed to be realistic. There are conceptions. We were a bit nervous about the stakeholder consultations because there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions around on-site sanitation, fecal sludge management. But the key point of doing the case study in Polokwane was to say, well, with this new concept in South Africa, if we're going to throw at municipalities and stakeholders in the private sector a brand new 10-year strategy that is completely unrealistic, then we're going nowhere. So Polokwane is a relatively representative city in the sense that it has a mix of rural and urban populations. It has quite a high number of sewer connections, but also a very high number of on-site connections. It's got it's subject to climate change hazards and shocks. It has a population that can't afford to pay for their own sanitation. So these conditions are repeated in a number of cities, in many cities and small towns across South Africa. So what works in Polokwane has got a good shot at working in cities that are not eThekwini Metro or City of Cape Town. And so that's why we did the case study there. But as I mentioned, we went in to the stakeholder consultations quite nervously, especially with negative media about on-site sanitation, shouting that eradicating pit latrines is only the first step. So we are fighting perceptions, and we also, from our fieldwork in Polokwane, realized that private operators might be a bit cagey, considering the situation. There's no fecal sludge treatment plants in South Africa. Wastewater treatment plants, it's not always viable to take fecal sludge. I don't need to tell this forum that, to a wastewater treatment works. So next slide, please. The Polokwane case study made being part of the stakeholder consultations and being presented as part of the consultations for the strategy made the strategy much more relatable to the municipalities and the operators that we were talking to. The solutions that we highlighted through the options analysis in Polokwane, and the options analysis actually includes a kind of FSM reuse, treatment and reuse options selection tool for municipalities other than Polokwane. We haven't released that into the public domain yet, but it will be part of the package of reports from this project. And we presented those solutions and how we came to develop that tool to all the municipalities that came to the stakeholder consultations. And that made this strategy quite relatable. There are some low-cost, low-tech, immediate solutions. There are also some incredible technologies out there that may not be viable or feasible in many municipalities, but that exist and could be tested, probably with external funding. The key thing about the case study work that we did in Polokwane and taking that into the stakeholder consultations is that it allowed everyone to acknowledge that we have a problem. Even if at first there was some resistance to the idea of pit latrines, FSM is very much seen as pit latrines. Hopefully we helped to change some of those perceptions in South Africa, but it created a platform saying, well, we've got a problem and we need to deal with it now, and we welcome the fact that there's a strategy coming that's going to help us address those issues. And I think the combination of the case study in Polokwane alongside the strategy very much made that possible. Also, private sector operators were in our workshops very keen to be acknowledged, and they want to support markets. It's their livelihood at the moment, and we found that people were much more open than we expected them to be, and that was because I think we had stories from the ground, from operators on the ground in Polokwane. There is also significant research underway, and a lot of that research came up in our consultation workshops, and a lot of it was then applied back into Polokwane, particularly with regard to the options analysis. So the strategy consultations were extremely well received, and the results of that process, next slide please, is that we are well beyond buy-in with the Department of Water and Sanitation. What we have very much is ownership. And as Suvi mentioned, while through the length of a project, especially in municipalities where staff are really stretched and pulled in a million different directions, particularly with a rate of attrition from illness, from COVID, there has been some waning of the commitment to the project, especially on the part of the municipal management. But DWS has really worked very, very hard to bring that back. And in fact, just after this webinar, we are going to be doing some implementation planning with the Polokwane local municipality. In terms of the strategy consultants, the ownership from DWS was remarkable. And we've got a second draft of the national strategy, which has been very much influenced, the provisions and interventions of which have been very much influenced by what we saw in Polokwane. It's realistic, this strategy. It's based on 6 pillars in each aspect of the service chain. We've got a series of knowledge and information tools which go with the strategy, which people can take to municipal managers or CEOs. And we've got some very good examples in South Africa of fecal sludge at work. So we've made great linkages between the city level, the municipal level, and the national level. But next slide, please. What about the linkages from the municipality to basin resilience? And here we've had some issues. Next slide, please. Okay, so we started off really, really well. The linkages between the sanitation safety plan and the urban resilience toolkit were very, very clear. They both deal with hazards and risks. Obviously, sanitation safety plan very much hazards and risks around sanitation, and urban resilience looks at hazards and risks in the broader context. So we had a good starting point for those workshops to commence making those linkages. But as the tools diverged, we kind of got into the weeds a little bit. And as Suvi mentioned, we start a whole set of new stakeholders that the sanitation team at Polokwane we were working with found it quite difficult to keep on board. And so when we had those urban resilience workshops, attendance was quite poor. And the urban resilience component was a little separate. So the linkages became very blurred as time telescoped and we were all at sea. Next slide, please. So we struggled to make those links. Water security is an even newer concept in practice than on the ground than fecal sludge management. And as discussed earlier, we had much stronger links with the sanitation component, and the team we were working with was the sanitation team. So our mechanisms, we don't think were right to ensure participation from the right people. We are on a learning curve with this. And perhaps our urban resilience team should have been part of the project steering committee. But next slide, please. But we grow because we struggle. We're learning from this, and we have taken forward the lessons that we've learned in Polokwane into our approach to fecal sludge management in Shai. So we are starting next month an activity. Well, we've been setting it up for during COVID, but we are commencing implementation on the ground in Shai next month. And these activities, the fecal sludge management activities, are now being integrated with the climate adaptation plan for Shai, and also the groundwater components, the groundwater management activity in the Resilient Waters program. The aquifer has some quality issues and salinity issues. The climate adaptation plan is obviously there's a risk from floods in Shai being a coastal city in Mozambique. And so we are looking at integrating the fecal sludge management planning with all three aspects. For example, a deeper entrenchment site based on a sanitation groundwater protocol. And then linking into local economic development. We've got communities working with mangrove and civil society working and government working with mangrove rehabilitation in the area of the Limpopo mouth. So our activity in Shai is very much building on the lessons from Polokwane. But one of the key issues at this webinar today was to get feedback from this group on any suggestions to take forward the linking of on-site sanitation or inclusive sanitation and water security in terms of mechanisms on the ground, which I think we're quite short of in the world today. But hopefully we have learned some lessons. Next slide, please. But we really need to know what we can do better. So thank you for listening to us today. And please, I see there are some questions in the chat. I'm not sure I've been keeping up with all of them, but I don't know quite how you want to do this. Do you want to move some questions while yes. I get some copied into a document?
Thanks, Robs. I do have a few questions that we received. There's one, and I'll just read it out and we can decide how we want to address it. One was from Teddy. He says, how does all of this translate into impact on the ground? We have another question from Dennis, who's very interested and keen in the Urban Resilience Toolkit and what does it entail? Aubrey has a question. He says, how do we get municipalities to integrate FSM and on-site sanitation and systems into mainstream thinking? Hopefully that's what we were able to share some lessons learned from that today. And then Najib says, working with multiple tools at city levels is powerful, especially if it is intended to build strong evidence for development, for developing planning and decision support frameworks such as master plans, FSM strategies, etc. Ideally, use and application of tools should be based on the key questions you want to answer and the kinds of informations or messages you want to transmit to decision makers, policy makers. So what is our experience regarding adaptability of the tools at a city and municipal level? At triggering interest / motivation for the municipality to prioritize sanitation in between addressing backlogs? And what was the motivation or interest in any way linked to the evidence generated by the tools? And what was your experience, if any, regarding integrating sanitation and climate resilience in broader urban planning and development context? So lots of good questions. Which one would you like to go for first?
Okay. Are you asking me?
Yeah, I can take the Urban Resilience Toolkit question.
You go ahead. Ahead.
Okay, so Dennis, the Urban Resilience Toolkit was quite interesting. when we started off with the sanitation safety planning, the first step of the SSP is a stakeholder mapping exercise, and it looks at the different levels of the sanitation service chain, and based on that, we were trying to identify the different stakeholders. So the Urban Resilience Toolkit has 4 components, one of which starts with identifying the stakeholders, and it is quite an interesting exercise. It follows, simple stakeholder mapping, but it takes us into looking at previous climatic events like floods or droughts or heavy rainfall incidences that took place in Polokwane, and going through a process of identifying first responders, second responders, third responders. And that start of the discussion helps set the tone for the rest of the Urban Resilience Toolkit. So immediately it was stakeholder engagement. Then we had to unpack the climate impacts, so the floods, the droughts, the high rainfalls, and just identifying the municipalities and the district municipalities' capacity to address those particular climate aspects. And then the third aspect of the toolkit looks at does a bit more research into those climatic events. What are projections? What are scenarios? And the final aspect of the toolkit looks at assessing the impact on the most vulnerable communities. And based on that, at the end of the toolkit, we take all of that information and develop a strategy that looks at addressing the different aspects of municipal planning. I hope that was able to answer your question. Thanks.
Well done, Suvi. I think, Teddy, your question was, how does all this translate to impact on the ground? Well, hopefully, I think maybe I answered in part that question by in making the linkages between what is realistic for a municipality in South Africa in the current economic context to do, and a national 10-year strategy for the very first for fecal sludge management. I think the strategy is much more realistic for the work that we did in Polokwane, and a realistic strategy at national level is much more likely to translate to impact on the ground than, I think, a strategy that expects everybody to have an omniprocessor in next week. Yes, it's in the current economic context, we've got to go for these, and Polokwane has definitely shown us that we've got to go for lower tech, lower cost solutions. And as I mentioned, we are doing implementation planning immediately after this meeting, in fact, with Polokwane, with some of the options that we've identified in the options analysis. Those options have been taken through to the strategy, and there are 3 really viable options for South African municipalities that you'll see in our options report when it's out. And also in the next draft of the strategy when it goes out to stakeholders. And those options are co-treatment with wastewater treatment works, co-composting, and deeper entrenchment. So hopefully those 3 solutions are going to get some impact on the ground, at least in the next 10 years, to help South Africa make a start on fecal sludge management. I hope that answers some of your question. And also taking the lessons forward to Shai and our activities in Shai should be generating impact on the ground, hopefully in another country other than South Africa. So from a sort of a regional point of view, we certainly are making some strides. In terms of the question about multiple tools at city level and our experience regarding the adaptability, the tools are very adaptable to a municipal level. Polokwane is a municipality that has quite a large rural population. And actually in the SFD report, we have done We did the CSDA at municipal level, but the SFD we have split into, an overall SFD, and then also an urban and a rural SFD. So that's really helped with our implementation planning for Polokwane municipality. We're taking that forward into our meeting today. And also it has helped us contextualize the strategy for different areas, for urban, peri-urban and rural areas. And because the strategy is not just an urban FSM strategy, it's a strategy, it's a national strategy at all levels. So just helping us take that forward, those tools have helped us to take that forward into the strategic provisions and the interventions that need to happen at the different levels, urban, rural and peri-urban, in the strategy. I don't know if the implementation of the tools have so much triggered interest. Certainly motivation, as I mentioned in those consultations for the strategy, it was extremely well received. I see we're almost out of time, so I'll get through this quickly. It was extremely well received and everybody acknowledges we've got a problem. I think the realism and the stories from Polokwane have really helped to contextualize that and make municipalities feel they're not alone. Number 3, was it linked to the evidence generated? Certainly. The Polokwane case study really showed what viable technologies are, what the issues are on the ground, and I think all the groups, the stakeholder groups we spoke to in some workshops definitely related to that. And integrating climate sanitation and climate resilience, we really struggled. But hopefully we're going to take that forward in our work in Shai. Aubrey, I know you've asked a question, but since we know each other well, can I ask that we discuss it afterwards? Municipalities are already to an extent integrating FSM because they have to, but it's not coordinated. Hopefully the strategy will do that. Anything else?
Robin, I've put our email addresses in the chat box. I think we can hand over to Jan now.
Thank you, Sylvie. Thanks, everybody.
That's great and right on time. There was one more question, if you would be willing to share the slides you used. Is that something we can do? We can arrange for that afterwards, and I could probably send these out to everyone. I'm happy to
yeah, we can do that. We'll get a clean version for external.
That'd be great. Yeah, I saw there were a lot of notes in there. So yeah,
version for external use.
Wonderful, great. We're a bit over time, so I'm gonna wrap us up now. But I think we had all questions answered. So thank you very much, Robin and Zafrida, for all the brilliant efforts and brilliant work that you're doing in Polokwane and elsewhere. And I think this presentation really had some really fascinating insights on so many different things, like, stakeholder engagement, what it takes to roll out tools and how it can inform the national strategy. I especially enjoyed also highlighting what can be done in resource constraint contexts, where it's kind of like difficult, where no money is available. So how can we deal with in these contexts? And yeah, some really, really interesting thoughts in there. Also on changing perceptions towards non-sewage sanitation. And all of that was super fascinating, but it also made it clear that there's still a lot of work still to be done. But yeah, I think it was a brilliant overview of various different aspects. I have to be honest, it was also, I really enjoyed seeing Ned Stark in your presentation. This was certainly a first timer for me in this series. So thank you again for taking the time to work with us on the session today. We're really, really grateful. It's been great to do this with you. Also, big thank you to everyone in the audience. Thanks for listening in. Thank you for asking questions and for engaging with us today. What's up next? we'll have our next spotlight session. Will take us to Vietnam for a general Vietnam country update and highlighting some case studies in the country. This will be happening at the end of June, and more info will be available in the next few weeks. So thank you again to our speakers, to the audience for your time and for your input today. Thank you, everyone, and we hope you join us again in June. So see you soon, and wishing you all a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.